and thank you for joining me here at Why the Book Wins. My name is Laura, and today I am doing my September monthly wrap-up, so brief book reviews for the 7 books I read in September. And I will be ranking them from my least favorite to the one I like the best. But my least favorite book, I still gave 3 stars this month, so overall it was a solid reading month. And then also my voice sounds a bit off because I have been sick, but I'm feeling better today than I have been all week, so I'm going to go ahead and film this video, so despite what my voice sounds like, I am feeling better, so that's good. And I did switch my Display Folio Society book. It had been Agatha Christie, and Agatha Christie is like October appropriate, but I have now on display The Haunting of Hill House, which is more October appropriate, and I got these cool Halloween candles as well as just some other fake candles, and these cute little Halloween kitty cats that I bought. So I kind of switched up my Halloween display, and you might be seeing changes to this throughout the month of October as I find new stuff to buy or to change or whatever, but anyway. So number 7 on the list is The Silent Twins by Marjorie Wallace. I did a book first movie for this if you want to check it out. The movie I really loved. It wasn't 5 stars, but I did really like the movie. I would highly recommend it. The book, though, it was an interesting story, and it's a true story about these 2 twin girls who refuse to talk to other people. They only talk to themselves, and even then they only talk to themselves like when they're behind closed doors. And then as they get older, you know, they become writers themselves and like are submitting works to be published, and then they get into drugs and alcohol and are influenced by these guys who treat them terribly, and then they end up doing some like petty thievery, petty theft, and arson. And then that gets them placed in a mental institution for a really long time. So the premise was really interesting. But yeah, Marjorie Wallace, I just thought isn't the best writer, and it was weird pacing, and I also just didn't love her writing style a lot of the times. And I talk about this in my book first movie, but she also talks about the twins as if they're like something so creepy and spooky and supernatural and what's going on with them. And it annoys me that she took that route and that so many documentaries and so many people who talk about this story, because these twins are very famous, June and Jennifer Gibbons. So this movie is not the first time people are hearing about them, because this is from the 80s and the 90s. And so this like myth and legend has been created about them, when really like they were just 2 girls who grew up into 2 women who just needed help and they weren't treated properly. And so it's just a sad story, really. And so it's annoying that Marjorie Wallace, who knew them personally, tries to turn it into something it wasn't. And the movie does a really good job of not having this be like a spooky story, because it's not a spooky story. So anyway, the book, there were some good things I liked about it. Lots of poetry entries from the twins and sections from their own books and stuff. But yeah, I just didn't love her writing style for the most part. Number 6 on the list is The Hobbit. Maybe you've heard of it. J.R.R. Tolkien. And this one, fantasy just isn't my thing. As you may have noticed if you watch my channel, I like never read fantasy. I enjoy sci-fi and I like magical realism. Jeff Vandermeer is one of my favorite authors, and his is definitely sci-fi and magical realism. But something about like high fantasy, which I would consider The Hobbit to be high fantasy, because I also like Harry Potter and that's fantasy. But yeah, I think something about high fantasy where you're just totally in this world, in a world so different from our own, even though you could still find the characters relatable. I don't know, something about fantasy I just have a hard time getting into, and I have a hard time being fully invested in the story. So it just ultimately wasn't my type of book. And I went into it really wanting to love it. Like I wanted for this to like maybe change my mind, right? And I'd read The Hobbit before as a kid and I liked it then. But even as a kid, I wasn't super into fantasy either. I liked adventure stories and stuff, but I read The Hobbit because Lord of the Rings was so huge, but I never got into fantasy. So I guess it's just never been my thing. Anyway, read The Hobbit, 3 stars. But honestly, even giving it 3 stars is generous for me, because there were multiple times where I was tempted to just not finish it because it was tough to get through, even though it's only 300 pages long. But I read this primarily because I am going to be on the Inked Film podcast where they are talking about the book and comparing it with the Hobbit movies. So my episode with them will be up like the middle of October. I forget the exact date, but yeah, it should be the middle of October. Anyway, yeah, ultimately, The Hobbit wasn't for me. Fantasy isn't for me, which it's funny because that's only in books though, because I do enjoy movies that are fantasy or like high fantasy even. But even in movies, that's not my favorite genre, but I still like it better in movies than I do in books. Anyway, moving on. Number 5 is The Pearl by John Steinbeck, and this is a short story slash, I don't know if it's a novella. It took like an hour and a half to read. I thought of not even including it on here because it was such a quick read. I also read Mr. Harrigan's Phone, which is a short story by Stephen King, but that only took like 30 minutes to read, so I didn't bother including it here. Anyway, I am including The Pearl, and this one, it's about a man who finds a giant pearl and he needs the money, and so he is trying to sell it. But basically, like, everybody in the town, all his neighbors, and all these other people who he doesn't even know, like, are just trying to screw him over for this pearl, right? And so it's a story, like, that has been told so many times, right? Like, about greed and more money, more problems, essentially, is the moral of this story. But I'm ranking it higher up because it is John Steinbeck, and he is an incredible writer. And there were aspects of the story that surprised me, like the ending I liked, but it wasn't what I had thought would happen. I mean, I expected something similar to happen, that what did happen, but it wasn't exactly what I had thought. But for the most part, this is a fairly predictable story anyway, and it's nothing like totally original. However, when you think of it in like John Steinbeck's life, and this was in the foreword or the afterword for the edition I read, someone talked about how, where when you think of like the man as being John Steinbeck and how this pearl the man finds is John Steinbeck's like success and wealth from his writing and the way the town turns on him and just is trying to use him. So maybe that's how Steinbeck felt himself when he became famous for writing these books, you know? And I do know when my mom was on for The Red Pony, she talked about John Steinbeck, how he left Monterey County and moved to New York. Basically, like, the people in Monterey County just weren't treating him well, I guess. They didn't like what he was writing about their area. Yeah, and so The Pearl just seems a bit reflective maybe of his own experience to some extent. So that is kind of an interesting perspective to have when going into this one. Overall though, it's not one I would highly recommend. I gave it 3 stars, so it's not like a glowing review, but anyway. So number 4 on the list, moving on to, I think I gave this one 4 stars. So the bottom 3 were all 3 stars. Anyway, next on the list is The Djinn in the Nightingale's Eye. This story was adapted into 3,000 Years of Longing, the new George Miller movie, so I have a book verse movie for that if you want to check it out. But yeah, this one I liked a lot, and this is a good example of how I like fantasy and like magic when it is still in the real world to some extent. I mean, even Harry Potter takes place in the real world, and then he's introduced to this world of magic, right? And so same with The Djinn in the Nightingale's Eye. It is a woman living in the real world, and then she encounters a djinn, and she hears his stories, and she has the 3 wishes. But ultimately, it is about the woman. But obviously, it's about the djinn as well, because we learn his story and we get to know him. And this one also has the layer of like, is the djinn real? Is he in her imagination? Like, who knows? And there's people can debate on either side, and I think it is up to interpretation. I have my own way I like to think about it, so you can watch my book first movie to see how I like to interpret the story. But I like this one a lot, and this was like in a series of stories, so there were like 3 short stories prior to The Djinn in the Nightingale's Eye, but The Djinn in the Nightingale's Eye is the primary story, and it takes up like half of the book. So it still is relatively short, but it's not as short as the previous stories. But yeah, I did really enjoy this, and I think if you like the movie 3,000 Years of Longing, I think you would like this book and you should check it out. And by the way, I really liked 3,000 Years of Longing. It didn't get great reviews, but I don't know why people were hating on it so much because I really enjoyed it. So I definitely think it's worth watching. Number 3 is The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. This one is such a great psychological haunted house story because Hill House itself, you know, is a character in the story, and it is haunted. But then it's also just so psychological in the mind of Eleanor and what this house is bringing out inside of her. And so, like, an incredible book. And the more I've sat with it, the more I love it. The more I hear other people talk about it, the more I love it. And while it isn't one that like actually made me like scared, because there's nothing like especially graphic about it, right? It is just very foreboding and this impending doom and, you know, this feeling of going crazy. And it feels like a fever dream at times in this book. So it wasn't what I was expecting, but I really loved it. Highly recommend it. My book verse movie for this comes out the middle of October, which we filmed this earlier this week, and I was beginning to get sick, so I was just like not feeling the best when we recorded. And then I have a guest on, Luke Elliott from Ink to Film, and he was recovering from food poisoning, so both of us weren't feeling 100%, but we didn't want to reschedule, so it was kind of a funny way to record that episode when both of us weren't feeling that great. Anyway, but yeah, love this book. Glad I finally read it, and I have my beautiful Folio Society edition right here, and it is such an incredible edition, amazing illustrations. So if you like Hill House, you should definitely buy that edition. Moving on to number 2 on the list, and that is Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. So this one won the YouTube poll I posted, and I am so glad it won. I mean, I think I would have enjoyed any of those 4 options, but Rebecca was incredible. I can't believe I took this long to read it because I like knew about it, but I honestly knew nothing about it. And so even though I had heard about it and it's this book people talk about, I didn't know what I was getting myself into when I started it. And I loved it. I will say it took me like the first 25% of the book, I was like enjoying it. But I think once we got to the 25% mark, which basically is when she goes to Mandalay, once she is in Mandalay and experiencing all of this, is when I was super invested. And then especially by the 50% mark, like I could not put it down. So good. There are 2 other books it reminds me of. I won't say which 2 because in some ways it could be spoilery, which this book has been out for 100 years. But hey, I hadn't known anything about it and I'm glad no one spoiled it for me, so I will not spoil it for you. Anyway, highly recommend. Fantastic book. And again, similar to Hill House, like this is one that could just be analyzed so in depth, and the characters, like you could go in depth into each of the main characters, which you have, you know, Mr. De Winter, Mrs. De Winter, Rebecca, Mrs. Danvers. So they're all so fascinating and so multi-layered. And I think on first reading, you might just take it as face value, but I think the more you think about it, there is more depth to it than you might originally think there is. Anyway, loved this book. Highly recommend. My book first movie for this will be out second week in October, comparing it with the Alfred Hitchcock movie. Yeah, highly recommend this book. And honestly, I was tempted to have Rebecca be number 1 for the month. It was a really close call between Rebecca and The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. And ultimately, I went with John Steinbeck being number 1. Primarily, it came down to the fact that the first 25% of Rebecca, you know, like when she and Mr. De Winter are dating, getting to know each other, that time in France, I wasn't like super pulled into the story, whereas Grapes of Wrath, I was invested like right from the start. And so that's ultimately why I decided to put Grapes of Wrath as number 1, but it was a super close call. But yeah, Grapes of Wrath, fantastic. Love John Steinbeck. He's an amazing writer. He's an amazing at writing these characters, and they have just such great character arcs too. So like ultimately where it all ends up in the end, I just loved, and he has great female characters as well, which obviously Rebecca did too. And it's also, you know, historical context as well, and there's certain things about it that can still apply today, sadly too. But yeah, so I really enjoyed Grapes of Wrath. More than that, like I loved Grapes of Wrath. I would highly recommend it. I do like East of Eden better when it comes to John Steinbeck, and I really want to give East of Eden a reread, so that should be happening sometime soon. But yeah, if you haven't read John Steinbeck yet, you definitely should. Like I said, The Pearl isn't one I would necessarily recommend, but if you are first reading John Steinbeck, you could start with his short stories. So The Long Valley is a series of short stories, and I loved them all. And then you also have The Red Pony, which I've always thought of that as like a children's book. Not children's book, but like something a younger generation reads. But as an adult, I loved it. So I would highly recommend it. And it's certainly not just for kids. So yeah, I would say maybe start with his short stories. But East of Eden, though, is one I really loved as well. And Grapes of Wrath, fantastic. So yeah, I'm naming that as my favorite book of the month. Book first movie for this will be out the first Wednesday in October, so very soon. And yeah, Grapes of Wrath being number 1 for the month, that means it is going head to head with Bullet Train by Kotaro Isaka, which is my current 2022 champion. Absolutely loved Bullet Train. So much fun. The movie is really good, but the book I just loved even more. And I am currently reading Three Assassins, which is like a prequel to Bullet Train. It was originally published under the name Grasshopper, but when Bullet Train was released, they also released an English translation of Grasshopper, renaming it Three Assassins. So I just started it today, but I'm really early on, but I'm already liking it. And I'm also just, because I loved Bullet Train so much, I'm just filled with so much excitement to see what happens. So yeah, currently reading the prequel to Bullet Train. But anyway, when it comes to Bullet Train versus Grapes of Wrath, I mean, this is tough because they are just so different. I mean, I still love Bullet Train so much, but part of me, like sometimes a great notion, Bullet Train beat out sometimes a great notion, which had been the previous 2022 champion. And I've thought back at that the last 2 months, and I'm like, sometimes A Great Notion was so fantastic. Like, was Bullet Train really better? Did Bullet Train deserve to beat out Sometimes A Great Notion? I don't know. But anyway, I guess between Bullet Train, though, and Grapes of Wrath, I would say Grapes of Wrath wins. But part of me is saying that because, like, in a literary context, Grapes of Wrath, Sometimes A Great Notion, like, they are the better written books. But again, like I said in my video where I talked about Bullet Train, it is just so much fun, and I was just loving every minute of that book. And even though it is fun and it's entertaining, it also, like, has a lot of heart to it too. So it's not just, you know, this action book or something. You know, there's a lot to it. But yeah, I guess at the end of the day, I do just love John Steinbeck so much. So I am going to say that The Grapes of Wrath is the new 2022 winner. It would be funny if I end up loving Three Assassins so much that I have Three Assassins beat out Grapes of Wrath. I'm not expecting that to happen, but it would be funny if it did. But anyway, my voice and throat is starting to bother me now, so the more I've talked, like, I'm starting to feel worse. But anyway, that wraps it up for this wrap up. I hope you guys enjoyed. Definitely read some John Steinbeck. Check out Rebecca. It was a fantastic book. Loved it so much. And then Hill House as well. So those top 3 books were all just so good. On Goodreads, I gave Hill House 4 stars, but I need to change that because Hill House is a 5-star book. So yeah, definitely read all 3 of those top 3 books. They were all worth your time. Hill House is very short. I think it's under 200 pages. It's pretty quick. Rebecca and Grapes of Wrath are a bit lengthier, but they are well worth your time. I got my sister to read Rebecca, so she's reading that right now, which is very exciting. And yeah, anyway, thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Comment down below if you have read any of these books and which one you like the best. And comment down below what was the best book that you read this month. And I will see you next time. Bye.